My sister claimed it was just a small budget venue, modest enough that I would not feel out of place. But right during the toast, the property manager walked straight past 180 guests and called out my name. Both families turned, suddenly realizing the person they looked down on most was the only one who could decide how this night ended. And that was not even the most expensive secret hidden in her wedding bill. My name is Brooke Martin, and if there is one thing I have learned after 30 years in my family, it is that playing the fool is often the smartest thing you can do. The wedding invitation arrived on a brisk Tuesday afternoon, feeling heavier than a standard piece of mail. It was a thick, textured square of pure extravagance, complete with a custom wax seal and shimmering gold foil letterpress. It was exactly the kind of paper that screamed new money and old insecurities. The names Sloane Martin and Adrian Hale were embossed in a sweeping theatrical cursive. But it was not the excessive luxury of the invitation that caught my attention. It was the small, cream-colored insert that fluttered out and landed on my kitchen counter. It was a handwritten note from my older sister. Brooke, we opted for a very small budget venue to keep things intimate. I know things are probably tight for you right now, so please do not stress over a gift if it is not convenient. Just bringing yourself is enough. The passive-aggressive concern dripped off the page. Before I could even toss the note into the recycling bin, my phone buzzed on the countertop. It was a message from our mother, Janet Martin. The timing was so precise they must have coordinated it. Did you receive the invitation? Please pay very close attention to the formal dress code on the back. Adrian has a lot of highly successful people coming from his investment firm, and we are hosting some very important clients. We need to make a flawless impression. I read the text twice. The subtext was not exactly subtle. Do not embarrass us by looking like yourself. I typed back a brief, neutral confirmation stating that I would be there. Her reply came through mere seconds later, carrying the familiar weight of maternal condescension. I am glad to hear it. But really, Brooke, there is no need to force it if you do not have the right attire, or if the travel expenses are too much of a burden. We would completely understand if you celebrated with us in spirit. They really wanted me to stay away, or at the very least, they wanted me to arrive feeling sufficiently small. This was the dynamic our family had cultivated and perfected over the last decade. In the grand theatrical production of the Martin household, I had been firmly typecast as the background character. I was the reliable, invisible younger sister. I was stable, yes, but according to them, utterly unremarkable. I was the girl who supposedly fetched coffee and filed paperwork while life passed her by. Sloane, naturally, was the golden girl. She was a networking prodigy, a woman who treated every single social interaction like a rung on a corporate ladder she was violently determined to climb. To my parents, Sloane was the epitome of success because she understood the currency they valued most: optics. In my family, you were not judged by your bank account balance or your quiet achievements. You were judged by the logo on your handbag, the neighborhood you leased your apartment in, and the people you casually name-dropped at holiday dinners. Success was an imported sports car financed at an absurdly high interest rate. Success was a closet full of designer labels and a job title inflated with words like executive or director, regardless of whether the actual paycheck could cover the rent. Because I chose to drive a reliable, 5-year-old sedan, lived in a quiet neighborhood, and wore well-tailored but unbranded clothing, my parents assumed I was perpetually hovering just above the poverty line in some dead-end administrative role. I never corrected them. The silence was a highly effective shield. The real test of my patience came 2 weeks before the wedding, during the mandatory family dinner. We were gathered at an excessively trendy downtown restaurant where the lighting was too dim and the portions were comically small. Sloane sat at the head of the long table, the undisputed queen of the evening, holding court with Adrian and his affluent parents. Halfway through the second course, Sloane tapped her manicured fingernail against her wineglass. She sighed, a delicate practice sound designed to draw every eye in her direction. She looked directly at me across the table. Honestly, Brooke, I am just so incredibly relieved we decided to go with a small budget venue, Sloane announced. Her voice was pitched perfectly, loud enough to command the attention of the entire table, but soft enough to sound like an intimate confession. With the economy fluctuating the way it is, I simply could not justify an ostentatious location. I know how stressful financial constraints can be. I wanted a place where everyone, especially you, could just relax and not feel intimidated by the grandeur or the price tag of it all. She offered me a pitying, tight-lipped smile. It was the exact expression one might use when donating canned goods to a local charity. My mother nodded approvingly at Sloane's fabricated humility. Adrian squeezed Sloane's hand, clearly taken in by his beautiful, frugal bride. I kept my face perfectly blank. I set my fork down quietly. "That is very thoughtful of you, Sloane. I am sure it will be beautiful. Where exactly is this modest location?" Sloane waved her hand dismissively, taking a sip of her expensive wine. "Oh, it is just a quaint little greenhouse property down in Virginia. Nothing crazy. Ravensmere Estate." I did not flinch. I did not choke on my water. I did not betray a single micro-expression of the absolute shock that rushed through my veins. Ravensmere Estate. My mind ground to a sudden, violent halt. The air in the dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stared at my sister, watching her soak up the adoring, impressed gaze of her future in-laws. They were likely marveling at her grounded nature, her willingness to sacrifice luxury for family comfort. But she was lying. And it was not just a small exaggeration, it was a colossal, breathtaking lie. Ravensmere Estate was not a small budget venue. It was not a quaint little greenhouse. It was an elite, sprawling, ultra-premium event space. Reserving it for a weekend required a minimum spend that would make my father feel physically ill. It was the kind of place that required a non-refundable deposit equivalent to a luxury car just to secure a date on the calendar. I knew this not because I had read about it in a bridal magazine, and not because I had attended a party there as a guest. I knew the exact operating costs, the vendor margins, and the strict contractual obligations of Ravensmere Estate because I knew every single square inch of that property. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. I looked at Sloane, who was now brightly discussing the floral arrangements with Adrian's mother. I looked at my own mother, who shot me a warning glare, silently commanding me not to say anything that might ruin her perfect daughter's evening. I decided right then and there to give them exactly what they wanted. I would not react. I would not challenge the lie. I would stay in my lane, playing the quiet, unremarkable sister who could not possibly understand the complexities of high-end wedding planning. I slowly picked up my water glass and took a sip, committing every single word Sloane had just spoken to memory. I cataloged the smugness in her voice, the condescension in her eyes, and the blind trust radiating from Adrian. A cold, sharp anticipation settled deep in my chest. If Sloane was willing to lie this brazenly about a venue I knew intimately, she was hiding a financial disaster of monumental proportions. The fake pity, the snide comments about my income, the narrative of the budget-friendly bride, it was all a frantic smokescreen. I did not know exactly how she was pulling it off yet, but my instincts, honed by years of corporate crisis management, told me everything I needed to know. This wedding was not just going to be a family milestone. It was a ticking time bomb. And as I sat there, quietly chewing my overpriced dinner, I realized that the petty verbal insults at this table were going to be the absolute least of Sloane Martin's problems when her perfect night finally arrived. I smiled, just a fraction, keeping my eyes on my plate. I could hardly wait for the wedding. People outside the hospitality and event management industry usually operate under the naive assumption that the business is entirely about tasting artisanal cakes, selecting rare floral centerpieces, and obsessively choosing the perfect shade of ivory for the table linens. They imagine it is soft, glamorous work suited for those who simply enjoy throwing a good party. The reality of the industry is drastically different. It is actually a brutal, high-stakes game of plumbing crises, fire code violations, shattered vendor contracts, and razor-thin profit margins. I learned this the hard way, starting at the absolute bottom of the food chain as a junior operations coordinator for North Vale Venue Recovery. North Vale was not in the business of planning whimsical parties or dealing with brides. We were in the business of corporate financial resuscitation. We bought failing, bleeding event properties just before the commercial banks could foreclose on them, and our job was to ruthlessly turn them around. While my sister was busy cultivating a highly curated social media presence and aggressively climbing the corporate networking ladder through catered happy hours and expensive lunches, my ascent was built on industrial-grade dirt and severe sleep deprivation. I did not schmooze my way to the top of the corporate ladder using a brilliant smile and a Rolodex of family friends. I clawed my way up by spending my 20s in damp, unlit basements, manually counting rusted folding chairs and cross-referencing broken audio equipment against outdated ledgers. My networking consisted of standing on cold concrete loading docks at 5 in the morning, aggressively negotiating with local linen suppliers and hostile catering companies who had not seen a single payment from the previous venue owners in over 6 months. My real education came from sitting under harsh fluorescent office lights until 2 in the morning, drinking lukewarm, bitter coffee while meticulously tearing apart hundreds of pages of vendor contracts to find the exact legal loopholes that were bleeding a property completely dry. Blood, sweat, and an unnatural tolerance for reading complex legal jargon eventually yielded massive results. I was not just capable at fixing broken operational logistics, I was ruthlessly efficient at it. After 8 years of turning financial sinkholes into highly profitable enterprises, I was pulled entirely out of the operational trenches. I transitioned from a salaried employee to an operating partner. I now hold a significant equity stake through a private holding company called Harbor Ledger Holdings. I do not just manage the staff schedules or the catering timelines anymore. I own a substantial percentage of the dirt, the concrete, and the very walls of the luxury properties we strategically acquire. Of course, nobody in the Martin family has the slightest inkling about Harbor Ledger Holdings or my elevated position within it. To my parents, wealth must be loudly and consistently broadcasted to be considered real. Because I drive a standard, reliable 4-door sedan that I bought used 5 years ago, they automatically assume I'm struggling to make ends meet. Because I refuse to spend $3,000 on a flashy designer handbag that will be completely out of style in 8 months, they assume I am trapped in a low-level, dead-end administrative role. My wardrobe consists of exceptionally well-made, tailored pieces without a single visible logo, which in my mother's eyes translates directly to buying my clothes off the discount rack at a suburban outlet mall. I gladly let them believe I earn perhaps $50,000 a year managing clipboards and answering phones for a mediocre suburban catering service. One of the absolute crown jewels in the Harbor Ledger portfolio is a property nestled in the affluent, quiet town of Ashbridge, Virginia. It is called the Ravensmere Glasshouse Estate. When our holding company acquired it 3 years ago, it was a spectacular financial disaster hiding behind stunning historic architecture. It is an extraordinary piece of real estate, featuring imported European glass conservatories, sweeping acres of manicured botanical gardens, and a grand ballroom built into a meticulously restored 19th century manor. It is the absolute antithesis of a small budget venue. Simply securing a Saturday date during peak wedding season requires a non-refundable site fee that heavily rivals a healthy down payment on a luxury suburban home. And the mandatory minimum catering spend is enough to make a seasoned investment banker sweat through their suit. When we bought Ravensmere, it was failing spectacularly because the previous management team was bleeding money through sheer operational incompetence and a distinct lack of oversight. I personally spent 7 months living out of a suitcase in a nearby roadside motel, tearing the venue apart from the inside out and totally rebuilding it. I completely redesigned the entire operational protocol from scratch. I instituted aggressive, uncompromising cost controls and standardized every single vendor contract. Most importantly, I built a bulletproof digital system designed specifically to prevent event fraud. In the high-end wedding industry, clients constantly try to sneak in extra uninvited guests, bypass premium liquor charges, or illegally manipulate local vendor discounts. I engineered a strict financial workflow at Ravensmere that made those entitled games completely impossible. Every single upgrade, Every extra hour of staff overtime and every additional bottle of vintage champagne requires a rigid, auditable paper trail and an authorized digital signature matching the primary contract holder. We eliminated verbal agreements entirely. Despite my intimate, granular knowledge of the property, the affluent clients who book Ravensmere never see my face or hear my name. They only ever interact with the local property manager and the hospitality staff. I am the silent architect behind the heavy velvet curtain, the phantom owner who only steps into the light when a severe legal threshold is crossed or a major multi-million-dollar acquisition is on the conference table. That is exactly how I prefer it to be. I keep my professional identity and my net worth fiercely guarded from my family out of sheer, necessary self-preservation. I learned a long time ago that in the Martin household, achieving independent success does not earn you respect. It simply turns you into a highly visible target. If my parents knew about Harbor Ledger Holdings, my mother would instantly demand free, unlimited access to our properties to host her prestigious country club luncheons to impress her friends. My father would suddenly have a dozen brilliant, high-risk investment opportunities he would expect me to fund without question or due diligence. And Sloane, she would undoubtedly be the worst of all. She would expect an endless flowing stream of family discounts, VIP treatments, and backdoor favors to subsidize her lavish lifestyle. Worse than the inevitable financial exploitation would be the constant psychological minimization. If I laid my corporate portfolio on the dining room table, they would not praise my work ethic or my intelligence. They would immediately attribute my success to blind luck, or suggest that I was merely a figurehead for a smarter, more capable man's intelligence. They fundamentally need me to be the failure, so that Sloane can shine much brighter by comparison. So, I lock my wealth safely away in holding companies and silent partnerships. I wear my modest clothes and drive my unremarkable car. I sit quietly at family dinners, swallowing their thinly veiled insults, secure in the absolute knowledge that I literally own the very ground they are desperately trying to stand on. The alert from my secure internal communication channel chimed at exactly 10:15 on a rainy Thursday morning, precisely 3.5 months before the wedding date. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly profit and loss statement for a newly acquired property in Charleston when the caller identification flashed on my screen. It was Miles Ortega. Miles was the senior property manager at Ravensmere, a man I personally hired for his absolute lack of sentimentality and his terrifyingly sharp eye for contractual discrepancies. He did not call my direct line unless something was fundamentally wrong with an account. I answered the call on the second ring. Miles did not bother with pleasantries. He immediately stated that he had a flagged client file sitting on his desk, and the system had frozen the account due to multiple high-risk financial anomalies. He read the primary client name aloud, Sloane Martin. A cold, clinical focus washed over me. I opened my own administrative dashboard and typed my sister's name into the global search bar. The file populated instantly. I asked Miles to walk me through the irregularities, keeping my tone perfectly detached. Miles began by detailing the scope of the reservation. Sloane had not booked a modest afternoon package or a Tuesday evening twilight slot. She had secured the premier weekend buyout. This was the most aggressively priced tier Ravensmere offered, granting the client exclusive access to the entire estate from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. But she had not stopped there. The add-on column of her invoice was heavily populated with top-tier luxury upgrades. She had requested the erection of a secondary climate-controlled glass tent on the south lawn. She had mandated a second, fully staffed premium cocktail bar dedicated solely to importing top-shelf tequila. Furthermore, she had contracted a customized outdoor acoustic sound system to be installed throughout the botanical gardens. I stared at the screen, doing the mental math. The total sum of these line items was astronomical. It was completely irreconcilable with her fictional narrative of a frugal, budget-conscious bride. Then, Miles reached the crux of the issue. He explained that the second major payment installment, a sum that amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, had been due the previous Friday. According to the client portal, Sloane had uploaded a digital wire transfer confirmation document on time. The system automatically registered the upload and temporarily unlocked her ability to add those extravagant upgrades. However, when the centralized accounting department ran their weekly reconciliation, the actual funds were entirely absent from the bank ledger. The uploaded document was a phantom. I opened the attached file labeled as the wire receipt. It took me less than 30 seconds to spot the manipulation. The metadata was a mess. The font kerning on the bank logo was uneven, and the routing sequence was formatted incorrectly. It was a crude, desperate forgery designed to buy her a few extra weeks of systemic grace. Miles cleared his throat, his voice dropping an octave. He told me that the fraudulent payment was not the most concerning part of the file. He directed me to page 4 of the modified service agreement, the section detailing local authorizing contacts for last-minute logistical approvals. I scrolled down and felt the air evacuate my lungs. There, sitting plainly under the header of Authorized Secondary Contact, was my own name, Brooke Martin. Beneath it was a digital rendering of my signature. It was an old, slightly pixelated version of a signature I used on standard vendor inquiry emails nearly 5 years ago. I stated clearly and firmly to Miles that I had never seen this document, nor had I ever authorized the use of my signature for this event. I asked Miles how the bride had explained my inclusion on the contract. Miles maintained his professional, steady cadence. He recounted his phone conversation with Sloan from 2 days prior. When he inquired about the secondary contact, Sloan had breezily dismissed it. She told him that I was merely her younger sister, who was helping out with the tedious back-end logistics. According to Sloan, I had a loose, entry-level connection to a few people who worked around the venue, and I was just acting as a glorified assistant to handle the minor administrative tasks she was too busy to deal with. I let out a single, sharp breath. The sheer audacity was staggering. She was using my name, forging my signature, and simultaneously reducing my professional existence to that of an errand girl, all to illegally bypass the venue's rigid security protocols. I told Miles to hold the line. I dug deeper into the billing history, running a full audit on the preliminary deposit. Another glaring inconsistency emerged. Sloan had aggressively applied for and received a 20% deduction on the base site fee. She had utilized a specialized community arts sponsor discount. To qualify for this, a client had to provide a valid tax identification number from a registered local arts charity. I cross-referenced the tax number she provided. It belonged to the Ashbridge Regional Theater Foundation. I knew that specific foundation intimately because our holding company had bought their foreclosed headquarters 3 years ago. The charity had been legally dissolved and liquidated. Sloan was using the ghost of a dead nonprofit to steal thousands of dollars in venue discounts. The silence on the phone stretched for several seconds. Miles finally broke it. He stated that under Section 4 of the Standard Operating Contract, the submission of fraudulent financial documents or forged authorizations constituted an immediate, non-negotiable breach of agreement. Ravensmere possessed the absolute legal right to unilaterally cancel the reservation, seize the initial deposit as liquidated damages, and lock the client out of the system. He asked me directly if I wanted him to draft the cancellation notice and block the event to shield the property from any further liability. For a long moment, I looked out my office window at the gray sky. Terminating the contract now would be clean. It would be entirely legally justified. But if I pulled the plug 3 months before the wedding, Sloan would inevitably spin the narrative. She would cry to our parents, to Adrian, and to their wealthy friends that a faceless, heartless corporation had ruined her modest, carefully planned day due to a clerical glitch. She would emerge as the tragic victim, and I would be subjected to months of family dinners listening to her lament the injustice of it all. Furthermore, she would likely pivot to another venue, continuing her cycle of financial manipulation and dragging Adrian down into a deep pit of fraudulent debt before they were even legally married. I leaned forward and pressed the transmit button on my microphone. I told Miles no. We were not going to cancel the event. I instructed him to keep the reservation entirely active and to leave the portal open. However, we were going to strictly enforce every single boundary of the system. I ordered him to initiate the standard automated protocol for missed payments. He was to send the scheduled warning emails, apply the contractual late fees at exactly midnight on the specified dates, and process no further physical upgrades until hard currency cleared the bank. Most crucially, I commanded him to document absolutely everything. Every time she called to make an excuse, he was to log the duration and summarize the contents of the conversation. Every time she uploaded a new document, he was to capture the back-end metadata. I wanted a flawless, indisputable digital paper trail of her deception. She had chosen to play a dangerous game with a highly secured corporate asset, using my name as her shield. I was going to let her have enough rope to build her own stage, and when the curtain finally fell, there would be no corporate glitch to blame. There would only be the undeniable weight of her own ink. As the weeks dragged on toward the wedding day, my primary role shifted from a silent observer to a meticulous archivist of my sister's deceit. It became a morbidly fascinating psychological study. Sloane was not simply telling a single lie. She was managing a highly complex, multi-tiered portfolio of fabrications, tailoring a completely different financial reality for every specific audience she encountered. I realized the sheer exhausting effort it must have taken her to keep the narrative straight without collapsing under the weight of her own fiction. The first distinct version of her reality was designed exclusively for Adrian and the wealthy Hale family. During a Sunday afternoon luncheon hosted at Adrian's parents' sprawling estate, I sat quietly nursing a glass of iced tea while Sloane held court in their sunroom. With a perfectly calibrated tone of profound gratitude, she looked her future mother-in-law directly in the eye and announced that our father had absolutely insisted on covering the entire cost of the venue rental. Sloane framed it as a matter of deep patriarchal honor, a grand gesture to ensure the Hales felt properly welcomed into our family. She painted our father as a quiet, generous titan of industry rather than a mid-level regional manager heavily burdened by credit card debt. I watched Mrs. Hale reach out and pat Sloane's hand, deeply moved by the fictitious generosity. The second version of the narrative was deployed 3 days later. Standing in the cramped kitchen of my parents' suburban home, Sloane was leaning against the granite counter, artfully dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She spun an entirely contradictory tale for our mother and father. She claimed that the Hale family, being so deeply entrenched in high society, had graciously prepaid the entire venue fee as a welcome gift to her. Because the Hales had been so incredibly generous with the real estate, Sloane argued, it was only fair and decent that the Martin family stepped up to cover the intricate, immersive guest experience. That translated directly to my parents liquidating a modest retirement mutual fund to pay for the imported cascading floral installations, the customized 8-course tasting menu, and the artisanal parting gifts. She was masterfully playing both sides against the middle, extracting immense social capital from the Hales and actual hard currency from our parents. While neither side realized they were funding a ghost ship, the third and final version was curated entirely for public consumption. Whenever she was out for drinks with her bridesmaids or posting carefully filtered updates online, Sloane adopted the persona of the fiercely intelligent, budget-conscious modern bride. She wove a compelling story about how she had utilized secret industry connections and relentless negotiation tactics to secure a luxury estate for pennies on the dollar. She transformed Ravensmere into a personal public relations victory, positioning herself as a savvy visionary who knew how to hack the wedding industry. While Sloane was busy curating these conflicting fairy tales, my secure corporate dashboard was painting a terrifyingly stark mathematical reality. Miles submitted his detailed weekly briefings, and the financial sinkhole was expanding exponentially. Because Sloane had failed to wire the primary funds, the automated accounting system had triggered a compounding late fee penalty of 5% per week. Furthermore, because she had never officially retracted her demands for the luxury add-ons, the secondary climate-controlled glass pavilion and the outdoor acoustic engineering were now permanently locked into the vendor production schedule. The required labor deposits for those 2 items alone amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. The outstanding balance had mutated from a simple missed payment into a catastrophic, 6-figure liability. The situation had officially crossed the line from a gross breach of contract into actively malicious financial endangerment. I needed an objective, ruthless legal mind to prepare the necessary countermeasures. I summoned Dana Mercer, the senior internal legal counsel for Harbor Ledger Holdings. Dana was a former high-stakes corporate litigator who viewed binding agreements with the same chilling detachment a surgeon views a scalpel. She did not operate on emotion. She operated on actionable evidence. I closed my office door, projected Sloane's digital client file onto the wall monitor, and directed Dana to examine the forged authorization page and the manipulated bank wire receipt. Dana sat perfectly still for over 40 minutes, silently reading through the timestamps, the metadata logs, and the communication transcripts Miles had diligently recorded. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of any inflection. She confirmed that we were no longer just looking at a defaulted hospitality contract. By attaching my name and an unauthorized digital rendering of my signature to the supplementary upgrade forms, Sloane had committed explicit civil fraud. The doctored wire transfer document elevated the situation into the territory of criminal forgery. Dana calmly asked me how I wanted to proceed. Noting that we had more than enough evidence to hand the entire file over to the state authorities immediately, I shook my head. Handing it to the authorities prematurely, or attempting to confront Sloane in the privacy of our parents' living room, would be a massive strategic failure. I knew exactly how my family operated. If I raised the alarm behind closed doors, Sloane would instantly activate her defense mechanisms. She would cry hysterically. She would claim I had fundamentally misunderstood her intentions. She would insist that the venue's online portal had suffered a catastrophic software glitch. Most predictably, my parents would blindly rush to protect their golden child, accusing me of being jealous, vindictive, and trying to sabotage her happiness. If I wanted to permanently sever my name from her toxic financial liability and prevent her from ever gaslighting me again, the truth had to detonate in a highly controlled environment. It required a venue completely devoid of escape routes, surrounded by irrefutable witnesses from both families who had heard all three versions of her lies. However, I had no desire to be a cartoon villain. I refused to interrupt the actual marriage ceremony. Whatever Adrian believed he was walking into, the exchange of vows at the altar was a solemn commitment, and I would not taint it. The reckoning needed to occur during the reception, right at the peak of the celebration, when the financial reality of the extravagant party directly collided with the legal reality of the unpaid invoices. I initiated a secure conference call with both Miles and Dana to establish the absolute rules of engagement. I instructed Miles that he was to allow the ceremony and the initial cocktail hour to proceed entirely unhindered. He was to wait in the peripheral shadows of the ballroom. I told him he would only move when I gave him a very specific, discreet signal. When that moment arrived, he was to walk onto the floor and execute the collections protocol. I emphasized to Miles, with absolute severity, that his demeanor had to remain entirely clinical. He was not permitted to show frustration. He was not to raise his voice to compete with the music, and he was absolutely forbidden from reacting emotionally to my family's inevitable panic or outrage. He was to act strictly as an impartial property manager, enforcing a binding legal document. He would present the unpaid ledgers, point to the forged signature, and demand immediate on-site resolution. Dana would stand silently beside him, holding the prepared civil acknowledgement forms. I was carefully building an inescapable, legally sound cage, and Sloane was happily walking right into the center of it, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the only key. The afternoon of the wedding arrived bathed in the kind of crisp, golden light that brides usually pray for and venue coordinators charge a premium to guarantee. I drove through the wrought iron gates of the estate just after 4 o'clock. The gravel driveway was already heavily populated, resembling a showroom for luxury European imports. I pulled my reliable 5-year-old sedan directly between a brand-new silver Porsche and a massive black Range Rover. The valet, a young man wearing the impeccable Ravensmere uniform I had personally approved 3 years ago, took my keys without a single flicker of judgment. I stepped out, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I had chosen my attire with clinical precision. It was a floor-length gown of heavy, midnight blue silk, flawlessly tailored and entirely devoid of any recognizable designer branding. It was the kind of garment that whispered of quiet, unbothered confidence, perfectly suited for a woman who felt absolutely zero need to prove her worth to anyone in attendance. I carried a small clutch and a simple, unadorned envelope containing my greeting card. As I walked up the sweeping stone pathway toward the main terrace, the sheer scale of my sister's deception hit me like a physical force. Seeing the invoices on a digital screen was one thing, but standing amidst the physical manifestation of her unpaid vanity was entirely different. I immediately began a silent, involuntary audit. I noted the towering archways constructed entirely of imported white peonies and rare orchids, a floral installation that easily cost tens of thousands of dollars. I saw the custom velvet lounge furniture scattered across the manicured lawns, substituting the standard cocktail tables. I spotted the specialized lighting rigs hidden in the ancient oak trees, designed to cast a perfect romantic glow over the evening. None of this was standard. Every single element I laid my eyes on was an aggressive, last-minute premium edition. Sloan had transformed a luxurious baseline package into a masterclass in financial gluttony. My mother intercepted me just before I reached the welcome pavilion. She did not open her arms for an embrace. Instead, she performed a rapid, highly critical ocular sweep of my appearance. I watched her eyes dart from the understated neckline of my dress down to the simple envelope in my hand. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, reaffirming her deep-seated belief that I was still the underachieving, financially strained daughter who could only afford a modest piece of cardstock for a gift. She offered a tight, patronizing smile, told me not to slouch in the background photos, and quickly darted away to greet a wealthy-looking couple approaching from the driveway. I moved toward the seating assignment board displayed near the entrance of the grand ballroom. I traced the meticulously calligraphed names until I found mine. I was assigned to table number 24. I knew the floor plan of this room intimately. Table number 24 was located in the absolute furthest corner of the dining space, positioned uncomfortably close to the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen and entirely obscured from the main head table by a massive floral pillar. I was seated with a handful of Adrian's extremely distant elderly relatives and a bewildered +1 who seemed to know nobody. It was the social equivalent of being banished to Siberia, a petty, highly calculated geographic humiliation designed to keep me entirely out of sight. I felt a small, genuine smile touch my lips. The placement was actually a strategic gift. It offered me an unobstructed, panoramic view of the entire room and immediate proximity to the staff corridors. During the outdoor ceremony, I sat in the back row, blending seamlessly into the shadows of a large oak tree. When the string quartet began to play and Sloan made her grand entrance, I did not look at her. I looked at Adrian Hale. He stood at the end of the aisle, looking impossibly handsome and genuinely overcome with emotion. His eyes shone with sincere devotion as he watched his bride approach. He looked like a man who believed he was stepping into a beautiful, solid partnership. He had absolutely no idea that the literal ground beneath his feet, the chairs his parents were sitting on, and the champagne he was about to toast with were all built on a towering foundation of forged signatures and outstanding debt. A brief wave of pity washed over me, quickly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The cocktail hour commenced on the south lawn, directly adjacent to the secondary glass pavilion Sloan had fraudulently ordered. The air hummed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of affluent conversation. I stood near the edge of the stone patio, sipping a glass of sparkling water, when the inevitable collision of narratives finally brushed against me. A tall, distinguished older gentleman, whom I recognized from the rehearsal dinner as Adrian's uncle, stepped up to the nearby bar. He turned to my father, who was waiting for a drink just a few feet away from me. The uncle clapped my father on the shoulder, his voice booming over the soft jazz music. He said it was an absolutely magnificent evening and that the Hale family was incredibly grateful to the Martin family for securing such a breathtaking, exclusive estate for the children. My father, puffing his chest out slightly, offered a humble, manufactured nod, accepting the profound gratitude for a six-figure bill he had absolutely no intention of paying. Entirely unaware that the Hale family believed he had already settled it, I took a slow sip of my water. The fuse was officially lit, and the two conflicting realities were now actively circulating in the exact same airspace. I retreated to the perimeter, leaning against a cool stone pillar, and shifted my focus entirely away from the guests. I watched the Ravensmere hospitality team. I observed the impeccable timing of the tray passers, the seamless coordination of the bartenders, and the subtle, authoritative movements of the floor captains. I saw Miles Ortega standing near the central archway, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd with the calculating gaze of a hawk. Everything was operating with flawless military precision. The stage was perfectly set, the actors were deeply entrenched in their roles, and the orchestra was playing right on cue. I stood in the shadows, silent and perfectly still, the hidden architect of the venue, simply running a final, comprehensive diagnostic check on the machinery before I brought the entire magnificent theater crashing down. The reception moved into the grand ballroom precisely on schedule, and the sheer audacity of the evening immediately kicked into high gear. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing a cavernous space bathed in the warm, ambient glow of the customized lighting rigs that had been added at the absolute last minute. The master of ceremonies, a man with a booming voice and a perfectly tailored tuxedo, took the microphone to kick off the evening's festivities. As the elaborate multi-course dinner service commenced, a long, exhausting parade of toasts began. The overarching theme of these speeches was almost comical in its complete detachment from reality. One after another, bridesmaids and college friends stood up, raising their expensive crystal flutes, praising my sister for her incredible resourcefulness and vision. The maid of honor actually stood in front of 180 people and used the phrase, "elegant optimization of a shoestring budget." She went on for 5 minutes about how the bride had scoured the earth to find hidden gems and negotiate brilliant deals so that everyone could enjoy this beautiful night without breaking the bank. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water, pressing my lips tightly together to stop a genuine, bitter laugh from escaping. They were enthusiastically toasting a financial mirage. The sheer absurdity of the situation deepened significantly when a bridesmaid, taking a brief respite from the crowded dance floor, collapsed into an empty chair at my remote table. She was flushed, her cheeks glowing pink from the premium tequila that was flowing freely across the room. She leaned in over the floral centerpiece, treating my table to an exclusive, behind-the-scenes secret. She whispered loudly that my sister was an absolute modern genius. According to this girl, my sister had not spent a single dime of her own money or anyone else's to secure the estate. She boldly claimed that the bride had leveraged her growing social media following to secure massive corporate sponsorships, effectively getting the entire estate for free in exchange for strategic online tags and brand visibility. I stared at the bridesmaid, keeping my face perfectly neutral. That was version number 4. A completely new, utterly fabricated financial narrative spun out of thin air to make her look like a modern marketing prodigy to her peer group. I just nodded politely, offered a vague murmur of agreement, and watched the girl stumble back toward the music. From my isolated vantage point near the kitchen doors, my eyes bypassed the dancing guests and tracked the subtle, frantic movements of the venue staff. The polished, flawless surface of the reception was beginning to fracture under the crushing weight of reality. I noticed the head bartender, a seasoned professional who rarely lost his composure under pressure, briskly walking away from the premium liquor station. He intercepted Miles Ortega near the shadowed service corridor. The bartender's face was tight with tension, his hands moving in short, sharp gestures as he held up a digital tablet. Even from a distance of 50 feet, I knew exactly what mathematical crisis was unfolding. The open bar had a strict, hard-coded financial cap tied directly to the initial, unpaid deposit. The thirsty crowd was drinking their way through the customized, top-shelf inventory at a terrifyingly rapid pace. The tab had just breached the authorized limit, and the system was flashing red. Miles gave the bartender a curt, single nod, holding his hand up in a pacifying gesture. He signaled that he had the situation under complete control. He did not shut down the bar. He was following my clear, unwavering instructions to let the process run its course all the way to the very end. The outstanding debt climbed higher with every single pour. The true, undeniable friction, however, ignited during the father of the groom's speech. "Mr." Hale stood up, a commanding, authoritative presence at the head table, holding a glass of vintage champagne. He spoke warmly about family, legacy, and the beautiful, honest union of two respected houses. Then, he turned his body and raised his glass directly toward my parents' table. His voice echoed clearly through the high-end outdoor acoustic sound system that remained entirely unpaid for. He stated, with absolute sincerity, that he wanted to extend his deepest, most profound gratitude to the Martin family for their incredible generosity in securing this breathtaking venue for the children. He called it a magnificent, selfless gesture of welcoming. I watched Adrian Hale instantly stiffen. His relaxed smile faltered, rapidly replaced by a deep, sudden frown of pure confusion. He leaned over, whispering something sharp and urgent to his bride. Adrian clearly and firmly believed his own parents had paid for the estate, just as she had told him. But before my sister could lean in and smooth over the confusion with another rapid-fire lie, my father, Warren Martin, stood up from his seat. Completely oblivious to the steel trap closing tightly around him, he raised his own glass in return. He puffed out his chest, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy room, and loudly proclaimed that it was their absolute honor, and nothing was too good for his little girl. The contradiction was no longer a quiet, manageable secret whispered in sunrooms and kitchens. It was now sitting dead center in the middle of the ballroom floor, impossible to ignore. Adrian stared blankly at his father, then turned to stare at my father, his jaw tight. The math was violently colliding in his head, and I could see the exact moment the seed of severe doubt took root in his mind. He looked at his new wife, searching for an explanation, but her smile was frozen, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. My phone vibrated softly against my thigh. I slipped it out of my silk clutch, keeping the glowing screen carefully concealed under the heavy edge of the tablecloth. It was a secure text message from Dana Mercer. The message was brief, clinical, and devastatingly precise. The final bank reconciliation was entirely complete. The forensic metadata report on the forged wire transfer receipt was fully compiled, printed, and sitting inside a leather folder in Miles's hands. We had the irrefutable physical proof. It was rock solid, legally binding, and ready for immediate deployment. There was no more room for excuses, no more phantom corporate software glitches to blame, and no more spun narratives to hide behind. The trap was locked, and the key was in my hand. I slipped the phone back into my bag and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply waited. The timing of this execution had to be absolute perfection. I let the dinner plates be cleared by the waitstaff. I let the band play 2 more upbeat, energetic songs, allowing the guests to settle back into their seats and let their guard down. Then, the venue staff rolled out the towering, 5-tier wedding cake on a silver cart. The massive crystal chandeliers above us dimmed slightly, and a bright spotlight tracked the couple as they walked toward the center of the polished dance floor. The photographer and the videographer circled them closely like hungry sharks, capturing the perfect romantic image. Every single person in the room of 180 guests had their eyes locked entirely on the bride and groom. The parents from both sides were standing close by, beaming with manufactured pride. Adrian's deep confusion seemed temporarily masked by the heavy tradition of the moment. My sister picked up the silver cake knife, her face practically glowing with the sheer triumph of pulling off the impossible illusion. As the silver blade sliced through the first layer of pristine white fondant, and the entire room erupted into polite, echoing applause. I reached into my small clutch one final time. I did not even look down at the illuminated screen. I typed exactly 3 letters and hit the send button. Now, the second the message left my outbox, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. It was not a sudden, violent disruption. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of the air, orchestrated by professionals who knew exactly how to command a room without raising their voices. From my distant vantage point at table number 24, I watched the heavy oak doors near the service corridor swing open. Miles Ortega stepped out into the warm, ambient light of the ballroom. He was flanked on his right by Dana Mercer, whose sharp, tailored suit stood in stark contrast to the flowing evening gowns surrounding her. On his left walked the head of estate security, a physically imposing man wearing a discreet earpiece and an impeccably pressed dark suit. They moved in perfect unison, their footsteps silent against the polished hardwood floor, cutting a direct, unyielding path straight toward the center of the dance floor where the bridal party was still gathered around the remnants of the tiered cake. The wedding photographer, sensing a disruption in the carefully curated aesthetic, lowered his camera. The bandleader, catching the authoritative stride of the venue management, subtly signaled the musicians. The upbeat jazz melody that had been carrying the room slowly tapered off, fading into a low, uncertain hum. As the music died, the lively chatter of 180 guests naturally withered away, replaced by a dense, curious silence. Miles stopped exactly 3 feet away from my sister. He did not cross his arms. He did not scowl. His posture was the absolute embodiment of corporate neutrality. Sloane turned toward him, her practiced, radiant bride smile still plastered across her face, though the edges of it were beginning to tremble. She clearly assumed he was coming over to offer a formal venue congratulation or perhaps to present a complimentary bottle of champagne. Instead, Miles pitched his voice to a level that was perfectly conversational, yet engineered to carry in the sudden quiet of the vast room. He addressed her directly, stating that he apologized for the interruption, but there was a critical, immediate issue regarding the outstanding payment ledger and the fraudulent contract authorization that required immediate on-site resolution. I watched all the blood rapidly drain from my sister's face. The pristine white of her expensive designer gown suddenly seemed to match her complexion. Her eyes darted wildly toward Adrian, then toward our parents, who were standing just a few feet away. She immediately reached out, attempting to grasp Miles by the forearm to physically pull him away from the brightly lit center of the room. She hissed something under her breath, a frantic, hushed plea to take this conversation into the private bridal suite or the administrative office. Miles smoothly stepped back, easily avoiding her grasp. He maintained his composed, professional volume, refusing to be ushered into the shadows. He informed her that a private discussion was no longer an option. He stated clearly that due to the severe discrepancies found in the financial audit, specifically the undeniable evidence of manipulated wire transfers and forged digital signatures on the legally binding event addendums, the venue required an authorized party to formally intervene. Sloane shook her head rapidly. She stammered, her voice pitching higher with every word, aggressively denying any knowledge of what he was talking about. She claimed there must be a catastrophic error in the venue's accounting software. She looked at Adrian, playing the victim, insisting that the management was trying to extort them on their wedding night. Adrian stepped forward, his jaw clenched, positioning himself defensively between his new wife and the venue manager. He demanded to know exactly what was going on and who had the authority to make such outrageous accusations. The silence that fell over the two families was absolute. My father looked completely bewildered. Adrian's father looked deeply insulted. Everyone was waiting for the management to back down, to apologize for the horrible misunderstanding, and to retreat to their offices. Miles did not retreat. He did not argue with Adrian, nor did he entertain Sloane's frantic denials. He simply opened the leather folder he was carrying and looked down at the top document. Then, he lifted his head, turned his body away from the bridal couple, and let his eyes sweep across the expansive, silent ballroom. When he spoke next, his voice was crisp, clear, and projected with absolute authority. He asked, "Is Ms. Brooke Martin present in the room?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then, almost in perfect synchronization, 180 heads swiveled. They turned away from the extravagant floral installations, away from the towering wedding cake, and away from the glowing bride. They looked around, utterly baffled. Whispers instantly ignited across the tables. No one could comprehend why the senior property manager of an elite, ultra-premium estate was halting a wedding reception to call out the name of the quiet, unremarkable sister. In the rigid social hierarchy of this family, I was the absolute lowest tier. I was the guest who was actively hidden away next to the kitchen doors. I was the one who drove the cheap car and wore the unbranded clothes. I was completely irrelevant to the grandeur of this event. At the head table, my mother let out a sharp, audible gasp. She lunged forward, grabbing Sloane's arm, her eyes wide with sudden, irrational panic. She loudly demanded to know what on earth I had done. In her mind, the only logical explanation for my name being called by security was that I had somehow managed to ruin the evening through my own sheer incompetence. Sloane, desperately grasping at the rapidly fraying threads of her narrative, tried to interject before I could even stand. She waved her hand dismissively at Miles, her voice strained and loud enough for the front tables to hear. She told him that there was absolutely no need to involve me. She announced to the room that I was just her younger sister, that I only knew a tiny bit about basic logistics, and that I had absolutely nothing to do with the financial side of the evening. She was frantically trying to strip away my credibility before I even took a single step, desperately hoping to keep me boxed into the pathetic, subservient role she had designed for me. I pushed my chair back from table number 24. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that cut cleanly through the murmurs. I stood up, smoothing the heavy midnight blue silk of my skirt. I did not rush. I did not raise my hand like a student being called on in class. I did not offer a single word of explanation or apology to the confused guests staring at me. I simply began to walk. I navigated through the labyrinth of tables, my pace measured and entirely unhurried. The sea of wealthy guests literally parted for me, pulling their chairs in to give me a wide, unobstructed path. I could feel the heat of their collective gaze. For years, I had sat quietly at family dinners, swallowing the thinly veiled insults about my career. I had endured the pitying looks when I parked my reliable sedan next to their leased luxury vehicles. I had allowed them to construct a narrative where I was the struggling, unremarkable background character. I had done it all for peace, and I had done it for self-preservation. But as I walked past the towering floral arrangements that Sloane had tried to steal using my name, that era of silence officially ended. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became. The ambient lighting of the chandeliers seemed to catch the dark fabric of my dress, emphasizing the stark contrast between my calm, understated presence and the chaotic, hyper-decorated spectacle surrounding my sister. Every single eye in that massive room was entirely fixed on me. They watched the supposedly invisible, lesser sister cross the entire length of the grand ballroom with the absolute, unwavering confidence of someone who owned the very floor she was walking on. I finally reached the center of the dance floor, stopping just a few feet away from the bridal party. I looked at my mother, whose face was a mask of horrified confusion. I looked at Adrian, who was staring at me as if he had never truly seen me before. Finally, I looked directly at Sloane, the smug, condescending golden girl who had mocked my budget at a family dinner just weeks prior, was now shivering in her expensive dress, completely trapped in the blinding spotlight. I turned my attention to Miles. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Upon receiving my silent confirmation, Miles Ortega immediately changed his entire physical demeanor. The rigid, combative posture he had held against Adrian melted away. He took a distinct half-step backward, creating a space of undeniable deference. He lowered his head slightly, shifting his tone from the firm cadence of an enforcing manager to the highly formal, respectful register of a subordinate addressing their superior. He looked directly at me and spoke clearly for the entire room to hear. He stated that they had secured the perimeter and halted all further venue services as per the emergency protocols. He then formally requested my direct confirmation on how I wished to proceed with the legal and financial breaches, officially acknowledging me before both families and all 180 guests as the authorized ownership representative of the Ravensmere estate. I looked away from the property manager and turned my attention back to the center of the dance floor. The sheer weight of the silence in the room was suffocating. Every guest, every family member, and every member of the bridal party was staring at me, waiting for the punchline of a joke they did not understand. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a sharp, carrying clarity that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I stated my full professional title. I am an operating partner at North Vale Venue Recovery and the primary executive representative for Harbor Ledger Holdings. My firm is the sole legal owner of the Ravensmere Glasshouse estate. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. I watched my family try to process the information, their minds violently rejecting a reality that contradicted everything they had believed for the past decade. My mother took a staggering step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. My father, Warren Martin, stared at me with a blank, hollow expression. His brain desperately searched for a metric he could actually understand, grasping at the most superficial detail imaginable. He blinked rapidly, his voice cracking as he spoke into the deafening quiet. But you drive a 5-year-old standard sedan. It was a brilliantly tragic summation of his entire worldview. In the middle of a massive financial and legal crisis, his immediate reflex was to evaluate my worth based on the depreciating asset parked in the gravel lot outside. I did not even dignify his profound ignorance with a response. I simply shifted my gaze away from him and looked directly at Dana Mercer. Dana stepped forward, opening the leather portfolio she carried. She did not look at my parents. She addressed the bride and groom directly, her voice entirely devoid of emotion, executing her duties with the precision of a surgeon. She stated that Harbor Ledger Holdings held a binding hospitality contract initiated entirely in the name of Sloan Martin. Dana calmly listed the baseline rental fee for the premium weekend buyout, completely shattering the myth of the modest, budget-friendly location. She then detailed the catastrophic amount of unpaid capital. She listed the base site fees, the aggressive late payment penalties, and the staggering costs of the last-minute luxury additions. The total outstanding debt was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dana confirmed that a rigorous chain of automated payment demands and legal warnings had been sent to the client portal over the past 3 months, all of which had been systematically ignored. Adrian Hale looked like he had been physically struck. He turned to Sloan, his eyes wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension. He whispered, demanding to know what happened to the small budget venue she had promised him. He looked at my parents, then at his own, his voice rising in panic as he realized the completely contradictory stories she had fed them all. He asked how she could possibly owe hundreds of thousands of dollars when she told him my father had paid for the estate, and told my parents that his family had covered the bill. I did not let Sloan answer him. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us. I told Adrian that the outstanding debt, while massive, was actually a secondary issue. The money could eventually be recovered through asset seizure or civil litigation. The primary issue, the reason the reception was currently halted, was severe, malicious fraud. I looked my sister dead in the eyes. I told her that she did not just lie to her fiancé and our parents. I stated that she had deliberately accessed a restricted corporate portal and uploaded a doctored banking document. Dana produced a printed copy of the digital wire confirmation. She held it up, her tone icy. She explained that forensic analysis confirmed the metadata on the receipt had been manually altered. The timestamps were manipulated, and the banking reference numbers were completely fabricated. There was no matching transaction in the Ravensmere holding accounts. It was a crude forgery designed to temporarily bypass the automated security locks on the venue system. But my sister had not stopped at a fake wire transfer. I took the final document from Dana and held it out so Sloan could clearly see her own catastrophic mistake. It was the supplementary authorization addendum for the climate-controlled glass pavilion and the outdoor acoustic engineering. I kept my voice dead level, ensuring every single syllable struck with maximum impact. I told her that she had digitally lifted an old, outdated version of my electronic signature from a vendor email I sent 5 years ago. She had pasted my signature onto the legal addendum, listing me as the secondary authorizing contact, effectively making me financially and legally liable for tens of thousands of dollars in luxury upgrades that I had never approved. Sloane began to shake uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. She looked at Miles Ortega, pleading with him, claiming there had to be a way to fix this quietly. She begged him to just run her credit card, promising that the funds would be there first thing Monday morning. Miles did not offer an ounce of sympathy. He looked at her with cold, professional detachment. He stated clearly for the room that she had already used that exact phrase a dozen times over the past 8 weeks. He confirmed that she had repeatedly promised the money would arrive the very next day, actively dodging his phone calls and ignoring his emails, while simultaneously demanding that his staff open second cocktail bars and build extra floral archways. He stated that the venue had reached the absolute limit of its contractual tolerance. The illusion was completely shattered. The golden girl, the savvy networker, the frugal, brilliant bride was entirely exposed as a desperate, reckless fraud standing in a stolen dress in the middle of a stolen estate. My mother began to cry loudly, reaching out to grab my arm. She begged me to stop, pleading with me to handle this as a family, behind closed doors, tomorrow morning. She hissed that I was ruining my sister's perfect day in front of all these important people. I pulled my arm out of her grasp. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy resolve. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Adrian Hale, who was now standing several feet away from Sloane, staring at her as if she were a total stranger. I raised my chin. I told them that I could have easily canceled this reservation 3 months ago the moment the first fraudulent document hit my system. I could have quietly terminated the contract, seized the initial deposit, and locked the gates. But I knew exactly what would happen if I did that. I knew Sloane would run to our parents and to Adrian, crying about a mean, faceless corporation ruining her modest wedding due to a terrible software glitch. I knew my family would immediately believe her, because believing her was their default setting. And most importantly, I knew she would just pivot to another venue, spin another web of lies, and drag Adrian down into a massive pit of criminal debt. I looked directly at Adrian. I told him that I kept the reservation active. I let the caterers cook the food, and I let the band play the music, because I needed every single person in this room to witness the undeniable, physical proof of her deception. I refused to let my name and my corporate assets be used as a shield for her crimes, and I refused to let anyone sign a legally binding marriage certificate or merge a joint bank account before they knew exactly who they were truly dealing with. Sloane desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. Her voice was a fragile, trembling whisper that she attempted to project to the nearest tables. She claimed it was just the immense, crushing pressure of the wedding planning. She pleaded with the room, weaving a frantic story about how she only wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for both of our families, and that the stress simply caused a single, isolated lapse in her judgment. She begged everyone to understand that she just lost control this one single time because she cared too much. I shook my head slowly, feeling the cold, hard marble of absolute clarity settling deep within my chest. I looked directly at her and stated that her excuse was the most pathetic lie of the entire evening. I told her that this was not a one-time panic attack over floral arrangements or catering numbers. This was a highly calculated, long-term pattern of financial manipulation, and this extravagant wedding was simply the grand finale of a decade-long con. I shifted my gaze to my parents, who were standing frozen, and then back to Sloane. I decided to pull the curtain back entirely. I reminded her of the apartment deposit she had tearfully begged me for exactly 3 years ago. It was $5,000 she swore she would pay back by the end of that specific month, claiming she was just waiting for a massive commission check to clear. I reminded her of the $7,000 she urgently needed 2 years ago for a so-called elite brand consulting fee that was supposedly going to launch her independent business. Then, I brought up the $4,000 she took from me just 1 year ago for a specialized vocational course she never even bothered to attend. I told the room, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that not a single cent of that accumulated money was ever returned to my bank account. My father opened his mouth, his face flushing red, likely preparing to defend her or downplay the loans as standard sibling favors. I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. I told him the stolen money was actually the least offensive part of her overall strategy. The true, unforgivable betrayal was the elaborate story she had fabricated to ensure nobody in the family ever questioned why I lived so quietly while she lived so luxuriously. I turned my attention to the extended family sitting at the surrounding tables. I asked them directly if they remembered the vicious rumor Sloan had actively circulated 4 years ago. The specific story where I had supposedly messed up the accounting books at my old corporate job and was severely demoted to a dead end, entry-level clerical position as a punishment. I watched aunts, uncles, and cousins exchange guilty, highly uncomfortable glances. My mother swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the floor. I looked back at Sloan and told her I knew exactly what she had done. I explained to the silent room that Sloan desperately needed a reason for my apparent lack of material wealth, a reason that made her look like the successful, thriving daughter by comparison. So she simply manufactured a massive lie. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, neatly folded stack of papers. I held them up in the ambient light. I announced that these were printed copies of emails and private direct messages Sloan had actively sent to our extended relatives. In these messages, she spun the elaborate, fake tragedy about my supposed professional failure, asking them to please not mention my career at Thanksgiving dinner because I was so deeply ashamed. She had used my deliberate, protective silence as a blank canvas to paint herself as the golden child, while actively ensuring the entire family looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and disdain for years. Before anyone could fully process the sheer, calculated cruelty of that revelation, a new voice broke through the heavy, suffocating quiet of the ballroom. It was a shaky, terrified voice coming from the outer edge of the dance floor. Every head turned to see Tessa Bloom, the highly sought-after, expensive wedding planner Sloan had hired. Tessa looked physically ill, her face completely drained of color. She took 2 hesitant steps forward from the shadows, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her logistical clipboard against her chest. She looked at Dana Mercer, the corporate attorney standing firmly beside me, and then she looked directly at Adrian. Tessa confessed, her words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic, tearful stream. She stated loudly that she absolutely refused to be held legally liable for this catastrophic fraud. She admitted in front of the entire room of guests that she had repeatedly warned Sloan about the severe legal risks of dodging the venue payments and ordering unauthorized, last-minute upgrades. Tessa revealed that every single time she raised a massive red flag about the budget, Sloan explicitly ordered her to just push the paperwork through and put everything under my name. Tessa took a deep breath and quoted my sister directly. She stated that Sloan had promised her not to worry, claiming that Brooke is just a low-level assistant. She is used to taking the fall for administrative mistakes, and she can easily handle the legal paperwork on the back end because she is too weak to fight back. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the guests. The sheer malice of that instruction was entirely undeniable. It was not a bride making a silly mistake under pressure. It was a targeted, weaponized deployment of my identity to shield herself from the devastating consequences of her own financial greed. I watched Adrian Hale physically recoil from his bride as if she were made of fire. The final pieces of the puzzle violently snapped into place in his mind. He was a man who worked in high-level finance, and the true reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He looked at Sloan, his face pale and contorted with absolute disgust. He realized aloud that he was entirely a victim of her carefully curated image. He aggressively demanded to know the truth about the massive brand sponsorships she had bragged about for months. He asked about the exclusive corporate partner discounts she claimed to have negotiated to pay for the florist and the band. He answered his own question before she could even open her mouth to form another lie. He realized they were all completely fake. Every single luxury she had flaunted to him, every story she told to make herself look like a savvy, modern businesswoman with incredible industry connections, was nothing more than an unpaid, hanging invoice waiting to completely destroy their future joint credit score. The brutal reality of the situation finally shattered my parents' dense wall of denial. My mother, Janet, stepped forward, tears streaming rapidly down her face. She reached out, her hands shaking, and begged me to stop talking. She pleaded with me to take this conversation off the dance floor and into the private bridal suite. She used the classic, desperate family refrain, insisting that we needed to solve this privately, inside the family, without causing a massive public scandal in front of Adrian's wealthy relatives. My father echoed her panic, his voice low and urgent, telling me I had made my point. I had embarrassed her enough, and I needed to show some grace to save the family name. I looked at the two people who had raised me, the two people who had spent the last 10 years eagerly swallowing every single lie Sloane fed them because it was comfortable and convenient for their worldview. I refused to move a single inch. I told them clearly that there would be absolutely no private conversations in a hidden back room. I told them that for years. They had actively chosen to believe the most negative, demeaning version of me because it perfectly fit the narrative Sloane had constructed. They had enabled her grand delusions, funded her lies, and actively participated in minimizing my existence to prop up her fragile ego. I squared my shoulders, addressing my parents, Adrian, and the silent, watching crowd of guests. I stated with absolute cold conviction that my objective tonight was never to gleefully destroy a party or ruin a traditional cake cutting for my own twisted amusement. If I simply wanted petty revenge, I could have just let them all drown in the massive debt tomorrow morning when the venue filed the police reports. I declared that my only goal was to perform a necessary immediate amputation. I was permanently stopping my name, my corporate authority, and my financial assets from being used as a convenient legal cushion for her ongoing crimes. And much more importantly, I was stopping Sloane from dragging anyone else down into her bottomless pit of deceit before the marriage certificate was legally filed and the financial ruin became shared property. I told them the truth was ugly, it was deeply painful, and it was entirely her own creation, but it was finally out in the broad daylight where it belonged, and I was absolutely done paying for the shade. I did not let the suffocating silence stretch any further into the evening. I turned my attention back to Dana Mercer, who already had the customized, heavily formalized legal documents extracted from her leather portfolio and waiting patiently in her hands. I looked directly at Sloane, whose perfectly contoured face was now stained with dark mascara and pure, unfiltered desperation. I laid out the exact, non-negotiable terms of her immediate future, making sure every syllable carried to the back of the room. I informed her that she had exactly two distinct options tonight, and neither of them involved a miraculous family bailout or a convenient corporate excuse. Option 1 required her to immediately sign a formal civil acknowledgement of the massive debt right there on the dance floor. Furthermore, she had to legally confess in writing to the unauthorized, fraudulent use of my electronic signature and provide a verified, heavily collateralized payment guarantee to the estate within exactly 48 hours. If she refused, or if she chose option 2, my security team would physically escort her off the property, and Harbor Ledger Holdings would formally submit the forged banking documents and the tampered contracts to the state investigative authorities first thing Monday morning. Dana stepped forward with lethal professional grace, handing a sleek silver pen to my violently trembling sister. Dana explicitly detailed the severe clauses embedded within the civil agreement. It was not just a simple debt acknowledgement, it was a legally binding, ironclad injunction. The document explicitly forbade Sloane from ever utilizing my name, my personal identification, my corporate titles, or my credit history for any current or future financial transactions, whether they were wedding-related or otherwise. It was a permanent, impenetrable legal firewall erected between her chaotic, parasitic grifting and my securely built reality. Adrian Hale did not rush forward to comfort his sobbing bride. He stepped carefully around the shattered remnants of the white fondant cake, gently taking the secondary leather folder from Dana's hands. He stood under the dimming chandeliers and spent 2 full minutes reading the forensic metadata reports and the undeniable printed proof of the forged wire transfers. The silence in the room was so profound you could hear the rustle of the heavy paper. When Adrian finally looked up, his handsome face was completely devoid of the warm, adoring love he had displayed just an hour prior during the ceremony. He looked at Sloane, his eyes flat and cold, and calmly stated that he was immediately suspending all joint financial procedures. He announced to her, and effectively to the room, that there would be no shared bank accounts opened, no joint mortgage applications submitted, and absolutely no legal consolidation of their assets until his personal legal counsel conducted a thorough, independent forensic audit of every single thing she had ever told him. Without offering another word, without a shout or a dramatic gesture, he simply turned his back on the weeping bride. He walked straight past the extravagant head table and exited the grand ballroom to place an urgent, late-night call to his attorney. Following their son's devastating public departure, the Hale family matriarch and patriarch immediately shifted into a strict, ruthless mode of wealth preservation. Adrian's father stepped forward, the friendly, welcoming demeanor from his earlier toast completely eradicated. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that commanded immediate respect. He addressed my parents directly, formally and aggressively retracting the generous, unconditional financial support he had promised earlier in the evening. He made it abundantly clear to my stunned father that the Hale family would not be issuing a single check or authorizing a single wire transfer to cover Sloane's fraudulent liabilities. They demanded a total, immediate legal separation of all wedding debts, categorically refusing to subsidize a criminal deception orchestrated by the woman who was supposed to join their family. Stripped of her wealthy fiancé, permanently abandoned by her affluent future in-laws, and completely cornered by an ironclad legal contract she could not manipulate. Sloane completely unraveled. The tears of panic rapidly morphed into cornered, vicious, irrational anger. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, screaming across the polished wood of the dance floor that I had intentionally set her up. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings as she furiously accused me of being a bitter, jealous sister who orchestrated this elaborate, highly public trap just to humiliate her and destroy the most important night of her entire life. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic hysteria. I did not need to. I simply looked at her, standing amidst the ruins of her own ambition, and delivered the final, undeniable truth. I told her that the only trap in this entire building was the paperwork she had voluntarily signed herself. I reminded her that I did not forge the bank documents. I did not steal an identity, and I did not lie for months to the man she was supposed to love. She had meticulously built her own highly flammable cage out of lies and deceit. I simply refused to leave the door unlocked any longer. The sheer wild finality of my statement finally broke whatever remaining, stubborn delusions my parents still harbored. The impenetrable wall of their denial collapsed all at once. For the very first time in my entire adult life, my mother looked at me not with her usual cocktail of condescension and pity, but with profound, crushing, undeniable shame. Right there, surrounded by the shocked, judging whispers of our extended relatives, she choked back a heavy sob and publicly apologized. She admitted, her voice cracking, that they had blindly accepted Sloane's twisted narratives because it was vastly easier than facing the ugly truth. My father stood rigidly beside her, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed in complete, public defeat. He quietly asked for my forgiveness for automatically assuming I was the underachieving failure of the family while blatantly ignoring the massive, glaring red flags I had tried to point out for so many years. It was a profound, highly emotional moment of family reckoning, the exact kind of apology I had secretly wanted in my 20s. But standing there now, a successful, independent woman in my 30s, I realized I had absolutely no desire to play the gracious savior or the forgiving martyr. I did not step forward to offer them a comforting hug, and I did not tell them that everything would magically be all right. The damage was done, and it was permanent. I turned my attention away from my shattered family and looked back at my property manager. I instructed Miles to allow the reception to continue strictly within the absolute rigid boundaries of the initial, legally cleared deposit. I told him the guests could finish eating the remaining catered food, and the live band could play until their contracted hour concluded, but the premium liquor bars were to be immediately shuttered and locked. Every single unpaid luxury edition was officially cut off. There would be no more extended grace periods, no more backstage favors, and absolutely no more free rides on my dime. I reached into my midnight blue silk clutch one final time and pulled out the small, unadorned greeting card I had brought with me. I handed it smoothly to Miles, casually instructing him to drop it into the heavily decorated gift box on his way out of the hall. Then, without waiting for another tearful excuse from my sister, or another hollow, delayed apology from my parents, I turned around and began the long walk out of the grand ballroom. The heavy oak doors closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly muffling the chaos inside. I walked down the sweeping stone pathway toward my reliable, 5-year-old sedan, breathing in the crisp, cool night air. I left behind a brightly lit, beautifully decorated wedding reception that had completely shattered its fake small-budget facade. The music was technically still playing inside, but the most suffocating, complex knot of my family's toxic dynamic had finally been severed by cold, hard truth, binding contracts, and the absolute, unyielding power they never once believed I possessed. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Where are you tuning in from right now? Please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy family drama. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, give this video a like, and support us even more by hit the like button so this story can be heard by many more people out there.